Good afternoon. Is that clear? We're live, fantastic. You're shaking your head, Joe. What? You've got to put the headphones on. How's that? Loud and clear, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and let me welcome you to the Resilience Hub. It's a pleasure to have many of you here in the room, and also to be joined online by many more as well. Those of us who are joining online, I'm told that you have access to interpretation services if you need them, so please be sure not to miss out. My name is Will, and I'm here representing the Building to COP Coalition today. And in collaboration with the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure and the IUAV University of Venice, we're delighted to bring you today's event. Now, together we've been collaborating to shape today's event under the title Building a Resilient Environment, a collaborative exploration of measuring and assessing resilience. And why the focus of this title, you might wonder? Well, because at the heart of this question lies a really fascinating challenge, and one that we want to explore today. Because on the one hand, measuring and defining resilience is really tricky. And that's because resilience is complex. It emerges at the interdependence between physical, social, and governance systems. So when trying to quantify resilience, it can feel like trying to capture a moving target. And to some degree, any attempt to measure resilience is by its very nature imperfect. But here's the other side of the coin. Measuring resilience is absolutely essential. Without clear metrics, it's almost impossible to unlock the necessary finance that we need for resilience building efforts. Investors and funders need that transparency and accountability before committing their resources. So this is the core question that we're exploring today. How can we meaningfully measure resilience insofar as to draw in investment toward a resilient built environment? And I'm delighted to say that we're joined by an outstanding collection of speakers today. First, we're going to hear from the academic perspective, followed by insights from those who are already implementing these actions on the ground. I'd also like to signpost that we're joined by Jess online. Jess is our visual artist who will be illustrating today's discussion live in action. We'll check back in with Jess towards the end of our event. Now, without further ado, let's dive in and get started. And I'm delighted to introduce Vittore Negretto from the IUAV University of Venice. Vittore is an architect and also holds a PhD in urban planning and resilience. His research focuses on integrating resilience into urban design, and he is a member of the International Panel on Adaptation Metrics. Vittore.
Hello, good afternoon everybody. Thank you, Will, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Resilience Hub for hosting us, and thank to all of you for being part and being here. Well, I've been asked to bring the academic perspective, so I also asked scientific literature and also the grey literature, so also all the documents that have been produced by multilateral organization and international network on how can we grab the concept of resilience, but also in assessing it. So I will bring you to something that is conceptual a bit, and I hope this view can then merge the view of the panel that will come after me in a way that we can somehow see first the theory and the concept behind it, and then see it on ground. How is this happening somehow? I'm sure you're all aware with the concept, with the definition of resilience, but I would like you to focus on, I'll move a little bit if you don't mind, on what the ability, what we're focusing is system, communities, and society. And then we have this list of verb: resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform. I'm sure that we can have a long list of this, but I wanted to focus on these two parts that I'll bring up back later. And the effects of hazard. So what are we science can be also really objective and sometimes treat things without passion. But I wanted to remind that why are we building resilience? Is resilience because also I've listed 3 events that are really close, touch my heart, and are still in my eyes and in my thoughts of 3 events that really touch areas that are part of my life. And I'm sure you can also think of many events that are still in the back of your mind when you think about resilience. So let's not forget why and what are we doing and for whom. And we get to the point that systemic risk is a mix of shocks and stresses driven by climate change. And to understand this interconnection, we have to think about our systems, our societies, our economies as interconnected, open network of systems, rather than a single one that we can fully understand. And we cannot longer go on with predict and control. So we're not sure what is happening, and we're not sure that we cannot control everything in a perfect way, as we could do, for example, in the design of a car, for example. So Salat brings here the idea that we have rather than engineer optimized system, we have to think about the systems, the cities, our regions, our societies as organic, evolving systems, which rather follow laws of resilient natural system compared to resisting of an engineered system. And this also brings 3 challenges that I would like to bring in the conversations of dynamic system, of things that we cannot fully understand. And it doesn't mean we have to not to think about it, not to try and to assess and to go on and build our resilience. But it's also, we have to keep in our mind that we are in a process that has to go through many times. We have to get back to the beginning many times, and we learn a lot by events. There's always one unforeseen event of magnitude or type that will take us back and say the picture of what we were thinking that was happening is not wide enough. We need to bring in something else. And these 3 challenges are understanding the system as it is, so the assessment of what we have, understanding what are the effects of interventions, and finally, what is the optimal future state? What is the resilience that we would like to see in the system, in our cities and in our societies? And the first one is about the baseline. We know with mitigation we do have a clear idea what the baseline is, but for resilience, the set of things that we have to take in consideration of this open system, we have to take care of relationship, influences, and exchanges with different scales and different systems interacting at the same time. So we can bring in questions in this first idea, bring in questions as, where can the system boundaries be traced? How wide? What is the area of influence of what I'm looking at? Which parts are precisely which parts build up relate to the things that I'm looking and trying to assess? And finally, what are the relationships between them? And the point is that the answers to these questions are not fixed. They can change over time in an unforeseen way. For example, we can assess indicators of risk and resilience. We have exposure, vulnerability, adaptive capacity. I'm sure you have been working on these indicators. But the point is also, for some of them, we don't know what is the fixed value that we would like to have. Sometimes we see increasing, decreasing trends. We see but what is the number that we would like? What is the good one? We can say it's above average, but also how this shapes our system is still a matter that we are always expanding the number of indicators to understand, for example, just the equation of risk, for example, that is built up with these indicators. And the second challenge is assessing the effects of intervention. So it means understanding our intervention, how will change the system, and why. And we know that some intervention driven by, for example, in the economy or in our societies or in the way we manage cities and regions, can reach an objective, but also trigger other consequences and other effects within it. And also the same goes, for example, with some hazard. We may think that our building is climate proof somehow, but at the same time it's exposed to energy grid failure, it's exposed to transport, it's exposed to all other effects that will be brought by the system outside. So we're still in a matter of understanding, and for example, this is all, I won't go through for a matter of time, but different impacts to different sectors and how they have some cascading effects. They're all interconnected, and we know something that is affecting infrastructure will trigger down and have a long list of cascading effects. So sometimes it's important to reach that first cause, not avoiding climate change. Of course, that's important, but also understanding impacts, for example, and understanding what are the key areas where we have to be sure that we are more resilient than others, because without that, the risk will spread around the system and have impacts in all our systems. And finally, and this is the overview of also based on literature, but also each case study that is analyzed have a different set of connections. So when something is happening, it will trigger other impacts. And finally, the third challenge that I would like to bring to our conversation and to the panel of experts that will follow me is how the system, we're not sure how the system should look like in the future. And this really is connected to our idea of what is the resilience that we want and what is the resilient society, city, region, economy that we would like to build. As we said, engineer systems like a car, we know what is the optimal future state for a car, and that is the car is functioning. Something breaks down, we change it, and we want to take it back to that function that it has. For ecosystem, for example, there's not a fixed idea of what they're always evolving, and invasive species in the Mediterranean, for example, are just consequences of many effects, but it's a state that is not preferable to another one, and it will continuously change. We don't have a fixed idea of how the ecosystem should be in a fixed and not evolving manner. And within all these challenges, looking at also the grey literature, so international organizations, a network of cities, how they build and bridge knowledge, they tend to define the idea of resilience through abilities, principles, qualities. You remember at the beginning that we said it's a system that can adapt, transform, and so on. And from different perspectives, the converging points are we would like the system to be prepared, adaptive, to be resourceful, to be redundant. So in a way that we have to, these are the qualities, let's say, of the future state that we would like to bring in. And this is based on literature, but I'm sure you also can think of other aspects based on your experience that we would like to bring into this. So bringing in a question also for later, it's also how do we assess the redundancy, how do we assess the inclusion, how do we assess the different qualities of our system with numbers, with indicators that we can then make them meet targets, make them speak the language of national adaptation plans, of NDCs, and so on. And coming to conclusions, a couple of talking point and key lessons is a good way to also make this ground, this principles to the ground is also thinking at the spatial and social dimension of what we are, of the resilience that we want to see, in a way that is we have to be grounded within the context that we are measuring, intervening, or living in. On the second point is also a good way is to have a vertical integration between indicators and the monitoring, so in a way to take track of our system in a way that they can also allow to talk the language of finance, for example, of the targets of a higher level where the money is also coming from, in a way that we can provide numbers and targets at the higher level, but also make sure that we access the lines of finance, for example. Insurance can play a role into this in a way that we have to avoid, for example, that as in Emilia-Romagna, it's a question that right now is, we have to avoid that insurance are the one who decide where we build and who builds where, for example. So in a way that we have to work with them with lowering and understanding is important part of the equation. But if we leave all at the financial insurance of our goods and assets, we may leave the decisions on how to shape our system to somebody else. So it's better to bring them in and work with them rather than having them deciding the system without us. And finally, the invitation is to think and act for the least represented, for those who can access credit, for example, for all accessibility of the spaces, for example, but because when we think and act for them, we are sure that we are thinking and acting for all, and we are building a resilience that is for everybody. And with this, I would like to thank you and looking forward for the panel.
Thank you, Vittore. Thank you, Vittore. You've given us loads to reflect on there. Your spider web diagrams really sort of illustrate that sense of we're dealing with a complex, dynamic system here, and that is often very different, and that should shape how we think about acting in such scenarios. And the three questions you've given us really resonate with that, and sometimes it is the questions that we hold on to are more important in guiding us than the answers necessarily, particularly as the system we operate with is dynamic and moving. And you've really set the stage for what comes next as we shift from theory to practice. Next, we're going to hear from those on the ground who are delivering resilience today. In our cities, in our businesses, and in our finance and in our engineering. And to help us guide us through this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Marcia Toledo, the Adaptation and Resilience Director for the Climate Champions team. Please join me in welcoming Marcia.
Thank you very much, Will. It's a pleasure to be here today, and very excited that we can have this discussion. So I'm delighted to invite to the panel Gisela Torrents, the Government of Catalonia's Climate Policy Officer. Please come join me in the panel. Thank you so much. Then I'm happy to also invite Joe da Silva, a Arup Fellow and Global Sustainable Development Leader, expert in risk and resilience of communities, cities, and infrastructure. And also to join me is Rodrigo Fernandez, who leads the implementations of Bentley Systems Sustainability Business Strategy and Initiatives. And last but not least, Nathalie Sinha, who leads the Sustainability Strategy and Implementation Program for UBS Asset Management's Global Infrastructure Private Market business. Welcome. And after this wonderful introduction, I am sure you have great ideas that help us better understand and connect how we are advancing and driving resilience. But first, let me do one question to all of you. If you can share briefly, what is your experience in measuring and assessing resilience? What this means to your sector or your context of work? And with that, I'd like to start with Gisela. Thank you.
Thank you. Better than this. Thank you very much for having us here. Well, as the government of Catalonia and as Vitor was explaining very well, to evaluate resilience is very complex. So for this reason, and first of all, I'm glad that we are here to address today and to address you and share the insights into our global indicator on adaptation on Catalonia, the version of 2024, because we had some indicators during the last years. which is the tool that we use in Catalonia to assess the adaptation level that we have in our territories, economies, and for our citizens. So the first that you need to know is that in Catalonia we designed and approved our own regional adaptation strategy to 2030. And this is a document with a full analysis of the impacts of climate change, and also with 100 of policies, proposals to adapt the economy and the people to this kind of risks, right? So in this document, it is written that it would be useful for the government to prepare every 4 or 5 years, something like this, an analysis on how Catalonia is improving the level of adaptation of the territory. And then following this part of the strategy, in 2014, we designed what we call the Global Indicator on adaptation. So the Global Indicator on Adaptation is a tool that we use as the Climate Change Office in Catalonia, and it serves as a comprehensive measure to monitor and evaluate Catalonia's capacity to adapt to climate change. And as I say, it was initially introduced in 2014, and it was conceived to assess the resilience and guide the evolution on our strategies that we had, no? And this is important because we are not only evaluating how we are managing to improve our resilience or adaptation levels, but also we are using this tool to know better which type of policies do we need to improve or implement, and where should we as government focus more and give more attention. So in the second part, I think that I can explain more about how we use this kind of tools.
Fabulous. Excellent to hear your experience, your perspective, but also how well you're advancing the opportunity to better inform and foster resilience. And then I'd like to turn to Joe for your perspective on experience in measuring and assessing resilience.
Yeah, so I've been working in the field of resilience since about 2007. And I started working with the International Federation of the Red Cross at a community scale, trying to understand the things that contribute to the resilience of a community. That was very deep research. We did it in Southeast Asia and then repeated it in Latin America, and that led to the Red Cross, Red Crescence's framework that they now use throughout the world. And then I started working on city resilience, and cities are not the same system as a community. They're a much bigger and a much more complex system. And so I was very fortunate and received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to be able to ask a very simple question: what contributes to the resilience of a city? So just as you said in your opening talk, it's thinking about what are the elements of a city that actually contribute to resilience, and what are the relationships between those elements. And that's sort of very fundamental. And out of that process, we identified the things that actually contribute to city resilience. And that was very deep research with cities for cities to really understand the things that make them stronger in times of crisis and things that actually hinder in times of crisis. So rather than trying to measure resilience absolutely, which is very difficult to do before an event, we said, let's not try and do that. Let's focus on thinking about the things that make the city stronger. And then from that, what came out of that was really recognizing that, of course, cities and communities, one of the things that they depend on is the infrastructure that underpins modern life, energy systems, water systems, but also the environment, the natural systems that provide ecosystem services. And so my work has moved into that space of really thinking about infrastructure resilience and how is infrastructure resilient in itself, but also how does that resilient infrastructure contribute to the resilience of communities or cities?
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. Very clear and wonderful opportunity as well to have your insights in this panel. I'd like to move to Rodrigo for your experience on measuring and assessing resilience.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. So, one of the key points that I was thinking of bringing here was infrastructure is getting old, right? So that was a main point. But then I was also thinking, well, I'm also getting old because I work, you made this question, I work for resilience since 2002 when we were doing modeling. I started as a numerical modeler, analyzing how runoffs, rain episodes would create runoffs going into the water and contaminating coastal water, which could create problems for people doing surf in Portugal and all that. So I come from Portugal, so that's when we started. Then I moved to flood resilience, and also urban water cycle management. Then my small company was acquired by Bentley Systems, which is where I am right now. So we don't sell cars. We provide software for developing, for designing, building, and operating infrastructure. And infrastructure is a system of systems, exactly. Like, in a city, it's indeed something like that, right? So for us, the kinds of things we do at Bentley Systems is not just too much water. It's also too less water, understanding water leakages in water drainage networks and or in water supply systems mostly, but also other aspects like, for instance, saline water intrusion. We have solutions where we work in some places in Africa, for instance, to analyzing contamination under the groundwater. Structural integrity, because infrastructure is indeed getting old and under pressure because of climate change, extreme weather events. And finally, also green infrastructure. We have scenarios where people are creating digital twins. For instance, in Mendoza, Argentina, they created a digital twin of all the trees that they have in the city, and it's very, very important asset for them to control temperature, for heat waves, for all these kinds of quality of life that they have there. So this is mostly what Bentley does.
Fabulous. Great to learn more about Bentley Systems, and thank you. And now happy to ask Natalie your experience with measuring and assessing resilience.
It's on, yeah? Yep. Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Natalie Sinha from UBS Asset Management, and I sit in their direct infrastructure investments business. So we have diversified infrastructure funds across the world, mainly in North America and and Europe. And we invest in pretty much everything you can think of for infrastructure. So we've got energy storage, renewables, data center, transport, water, utilities, healthcare, and lots of other things as well. And our investment time horizon is typically 5 to 10 years, but in some cases it can be up to 20. So it's quite a long investment time horizon. And we've built resilience into our investment process. So we screen for physical climate risks using a physical climate risk software, which a lot of other infrastructure funds do as well. And then that comes out with a scoring of whether it's like low, medium, high, or extreme for lots of different types of physical climate risks. So storms, floods, extreme heat, drought, and lots of other bits as well. And from that, we then determine which are actually the most material risks for those assets. So, for example, the risk that if the software says you've got high risks for extreme heat or drought for a data center, we might think about this and think what this actually means for that data center in that specific location. Ask ourselves, do we actually agree with this, with what the data's telling us? So it's all about looking at the specific asset. And then we look at the control measures that are in place and ask ourselves whether the control measures are sufficient or if there's more that we need to be doing to reduce the risk in that specific case. And also, one thing is the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the EU taxonomy has some guidance on climate adaptation and how to think about that. So we do use that for some of our funds that have sustainable investments as well. But, business continuity matters for the bottom line of the companies we invest into.
Excellent. And this is one of the main reasons why I'm so excited to be moderating this panel. As Director for Adaptation and Resilience on the Climate Champions, we are mobilizing, bringing together those non-state actors, subnational regions, financiers, specialists, coalitions, leaders that help us better elevate those opportunities, clarify how we can better assess them, but also especially get the funding to the right level and move to the pace and scale that we need. And so in that sense, Gisela, could you give us a sense about your approach, how you approach a complex and multifaceted topic such as resilience at the regional level?
Sure, thank you. Well, as I was saying, we analyzed in the past, in 2014 and in 2019, our level of adaptation, and we are doing it again in 2024. So with each update, we are getting a more refined, a more broader kind of analysis, and we are including new indicators, right? So I like to think that this methodology is quite new and quite pioneering in Catalonia, and I would say in Spain too. So we are making, we have already made 2 analyses, and right now in 2024 we are working the 3rd one, and we included 32 more indicators. So we had 42 in the last version of this analysis, and now we have 74 indicators. And the nice thing about this, in this year exactly, is that we are including for the first time indicators specifically to assess climate justice. So climate justice, we know that is one of the principles that our adaptation strategy must account for the disproportionate impacts of climate change. It's about ensuring fairness and also equity and inclusion in our territory. So I think that Catalonia has long recognized that the climate crisis is not only a crisis about the environment, it's a social crisis, right? And this affects inequally to all the people. We're talking about children, we're talking about young people, elderly people, women, but also migrants without papers, unrecognized migrants, and also poor people. So we based our indicators on the climate justice field in the human rights. And for each human right, we decided 1 to 5 indicators to kind of calculate how we were managing to make their life more adaptive to the impacts of climate change. And for example, for the right of housing, we are evaluating how much of the normal salary of one citizen is intended to pay the rent, for example, right? For the right to energy, we are studying how many people are unable to keep their houses to an adequate temperature, because we know that Catalonia will suffer from droughts, will suffer from heat waves, and then it is essential that to know how many people will not have access to the right temperatures or to the access of fresh water, for example. Another indicator that we are studying is on poverty, how many people in Catalonia is living in a state of poverty. And for the human right to health, for example, we are evaluating the ratio of health professionals to population and the availability of social services. So we know that the climate crisis with the climate crisis, more and more people will suffer of health distress, and we need to ensure that these communities, the vulnerable communities, are supported by our public services.
Very clear. Thank you very much to bring people at the center of the efforts of the region to bring resilience. Excellent. Thank you very much. And then, Joe, could you tell us who are the main stakeholders driving the demand for resilient assessment? What specific outcomes are they seeking?
Okay, I'm going to start in a slightly unusual place because already in terms of the comments on the panels, Gisela here is clearly really looking through what I call a resilience lens and looking at the underlying vulnerabilities, because resilience compounds those vulnerabilities. At the other end of the panel, we've got finance looking at the risk of their investments. And I'm very worried at the moment because people are using the words risk and resilience totally interchangeably, and they're actually very different things. So risk is about understanding the hazards that we're going to face, being able to predict those, and because climate science has improved so much, actually it's much more predictable than it was 10 years ago, and thinking about physical exposure and vulnerability. And reporting, ESG reporting, particularly TCFD, has thrown the spotlight on physical risk. So we as a company are getting a lot of organizations coming to us wanting to have physical risk assessments of their assets. And that's complicated in itself because people want risk assessments for different reasons. There is no one type of risk assessment. And you do a risk assessment for a reason. You do it because you want to make decisions about something. So you actually have to understand what are you going to do differently as a result of the risk assessment to understand the type of risk assessment that you need. And so one of the things that we published earlier this year is a risk taxonomy. It identifies 4 levels of risk, and it identifies the outcomes, the outputs, the data, the types of data, so to help people understand what they need to ask for. Because there's no point asking a firm like mine to carry out a very, very detailed, very expensive risk assessment when actually a much less granular assessment would give you the information you need. Whereas resilience is very different. It's not linear. It's about complexity. It's about managing uncertainty. And that's a very different type of assessment. And at the moment, the conundrum we have is that we're worried about the resilience of communities in the future, not just to climate change, but to the myriad of hazards they face. You know, pandemic came out of the blue and affected us all. So we're worried about the resilience of the communities, and that requires a large number of indicators, just as Gisela described. But on the other hand, we've got, in terms of where the climate conversation is at, we're trying to identify funding for adaptation and resilience, which will probably go towards physical assets. And we've then got to think about, are those physical assets resilient in themselves? Are they going to contribute to the resilience of communities? And then if they do, they will deliver the return on investment and become resilient investments. But we're not yet at the point where we've got a common language that we're all using to unify this conversation.
Thank you very much, Joe. You couldn't explain it much clearer than that. That's perfect and exactly what we need. The clarity of the narrative, but as well the opportunities to move forward for the investments that are right for the right type of risks. Happy now to ask Rodrigo the same question. Who, in your context, are the main stakeholders driving the demand for resilience assessment, and what specific outcomes are they seeking?
Right. So for us, providing software, we do, and digital twins for infrastructure and the surrounding environment. What we are more focused in our side is to provide indicators and risk indicators and those kinds of indicators that eventually, and you should use that to make your own decisions. We can go into discussion if we have a common language to discuss what is resilient and what's not. There's a human fact there, human behavior. I can give you an example. For sure, if you have 35 degrees in Lisbon, there will be a different behavior there from the people compared to 35 degrees in Denmark or in other place. And then people, well, are they resilient? Well, they will have, you need to go to the indicators and find out, right? But the analysis from someone in the Northern Europe will be different from someone in other parts of the world. The same with water. You can define if, there's always some degree of subjectivity. Bentley Systems is not going to define how you are going to establish that line there, okay? What we do is to quantify, and we do believe that we can quantify that, just to go into those points. In terms of the stakeholders that are involved with us are exactly those asset owners, environmental agencies in cities, water utilities. They are doing more and more quantification on too much water, too less water, non-revenue water that is there. Also below the ground, trying to identify aspects like I was mentioning in terms of water availability and contamination of water. They need to understand what's exactly the current state, what's going to happen if something comes up, and if they are going to be able to respond to a system like that. So we try to provide all those indicators to them, and we can go into in the future, in the next questions, we can go into discussions about how can and who should do this. But for us, the stakeholders that we have involved, the municipalities, water agencies, utilities, ports, seaports, those are the kinds of stakeholders that are mostly asking us and coming to us. Of course, engineering firms like Arup and others that also come to us because they need software to make these analysis and to make these kinds of insights.
Perfect. Fabulous. Very critical, that point that solutions and ways to assess the opportunities can be converged and have some sense of common approaches, but the contexts are different, and it's all right, it needs to be different, and we have to live with that duality, but we need also the practicality of common approaches, common languages, common ways to understand and break the complexity in manageable parts that we can then use for decision making. So thank you. And then in that sense, for you, Nathalie, is there a demand for resilience assessment to support investment into resilience building efforts today?
Thanks, yeah. And firstly, I do agree with Joe that I think that the resilience conversation in the community I sit in is at an early stage. I think we're still talking a lot about climate risk management, basically. And I think the conversation does need to advance a bit. Also, climate mitigation still gets pretty much all of the airtime because it's actually an investable thing, and everyone talks about net zero, their net zero targets, climate solutions. So I think that adaptation, to be honest, feels a bit of a fringe part of the conversation from where I'm sitting. And we did something quite interesting on a bit of our portfolio in the equity business, where we basically tested the physical climate risk. We added on our own understanding of the asset, and then in our valuation process, which we do every year, we asked ourselves, are these physical climate risks going to have an impact on the value of the assets? And I was quite surprised by the outcome, because actually the investment team were telling me that the outcome is basically financially immaterial at this point. Which, when you've got a data center and near London, where there was a day it was 40 degrees, I couldn't believe it, and the data center was close to an outage, and the cooling system was close to failing, common across other data centers in the UK on that day. But in the end, when you model it, it has a very immaterial financial impact, which I think is quite an interesting dynamic. And it's because other factors at the minute impact the value more, so interest rates, discount rates, the business expansion plans, and how the business is performing. So I think at the minute, if the data is telling you that the impact is relatively low, it's quite hard to justify adaptation and resilience investments. And I think there is some element of loss and damage kind of being accepted for the minute.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and they're definitely showing us that we still have the opportunity to continue working with the finance sector and expand those investable cases for artificial resilience, which they are, but I guess not that mainstream as you were showing us. Let me go back to Rodrigo. From a technology perspective, what are some specific tools or methods for assessing resilience in cities?
So we started by visualizing a very good presentation of the situation, of the complexity of what we are dealing with, right? The system of systems, the interconnected systems. So we do believe that we need, when we talk about infrastructure, natural or built infrastructure, there's something that we believe that is infrastructure intelligence that is really needed for us. We need those kinds of something that can allow us to anticipate problems, and it's before, during, and after a situation of a hazard or crisis. We need to be always following up and anticipating the problem. So you need what-if scenarios, you need early warning systems, you need nowcast, you need analyze the damages and finding out if this situation created a problem to what you have there, and inspect and maintain and repair. All these are important, right? So then you need data, in situ data, you need remote sensing. So in many cases you might send drones, you might have satellites. Then you use models to try to, physics-based models to try to anticipate, to make simulations. And then of course you have AI that can also bring all this together, and we come up with something that is a digital twin, right? Digital twin is where you can combine and fuse and merge all this information so that you extract insights from the data that you have, and start putting some intelligence as part of the data that you have there. So we really believe that when you have that, you can also move into a situation where you can be more efficient, doing more with less, which is really important because in many cases we have projects of places like Kentucky. I remember they analyzed more than one, I think not more than, but around 1,000 bridges that were inspected in less than 1 year, and they were able to respond to floods that destroyed several bridges there, and just because they had a real smart system for inspecting the bridges with drones, with computer vision and AI for crack detection, for finding out all these situations that they could identify, and those kinds of systems today with the technology that exists, we believe that it's really an important way not only to create these insights, but something that in many cases we don't speak about, which is communication, right? You need powerful visualization tools, powerful ways to create a way of communicating to all levels, all level of people. The citizens, the decision makers, everyone need to be more aware, right? So you might have the indicators, you might have the data, you might know all this, but if you don't communicate properly, then you fail to be resilient, right?
This is excellent. And in that, I would like to go back to Natalie then. What do you think is the specific criteria or metrics that investors and finance are looking for these resilience assessments, in these resilience assessments?
Yeah, so at the minute, we're using the climate risk software to give us an analysis on what the impact will be. And I think on the real estate side, it's a bit more well developed because I know my colleagues are working very hard on dashboards to flag the risk, to check in detail for each building if there's enough resilience built in. But yeah, for us at the minute, we don't actually have a set list of metrics that we look at. We primarily look at the physical climate risk.
Thank you very much. And in that context, Joe, bringing all these points together in regards of the opportunity for investing, the opportunity for improving decision making and driving common narratives, what have you learned from implementing the Cities Resilience Index over the past decade?
Yeah, so the City Resilience Framework, or the City Resilience Index, was something we published at the World Urban Forum in 2014. And it was the result of 2 years of research. And then it was adopted by the 100 Resilient Cities program and used in 100 cities by then. But it's also been used by us and by others in many other cities. And, Rodrigo talked about the importance of, one thing about resilience is about the ability to anticipate. Another part of resilience is actually the ability to learn. And we thought that given the fact that 10 years ago, city resilience was a very nascent topic, it would be worthwhile to look at the literature and to re-engage with the cities who'd used our framework and to understand what had changed. And so we've just republished a new version of the City Resilience Framework, and that incorporates the learning from the last 10 years. And remember, we've had the pandemic in the last 10 years, but we've also had, conflicts. But cities have experienced other issues like congestion, like flooding, like migration into their city. So it's not just about climate change. That's the first sort of key learning. Secondly, things like social justice, education have come up much, much more strongly. The importance of nature-based solutions have come up much more strongly. But the one thing that was really important, the biggest demand was it's got to be more actionable. We've got to move beyond assessing resilience and actually get into taking action to take resilience. And so what we've done is essentially the City Resilience Framework, 90% of it is the same. The indicators haven't changed that much. But we've rearranged them into 22 things that contribute to the resilience of the city. And those are very aligned with the governance in cities. So that actually a department within a city can see how their bit of their job, the bit that they're responsible for, can kind of contribute to resilience as a whole. What we're doing at the moment is mapping actions that cities have taken against that framework to then go the next step and say what types of finance will fund what types of action. So in some cases it will be municipal finance from local revenues, or it might be national distributions of finance, but in other cases it will be things that private sector finance can fund. In other areas it will be institutional investors. And so we're trying to keep it very clear and very simple. And that's not in any way to negate the detailed modeling that's going on, in firms like Bentley and UBS. It's just recognizing the fact that in a lot of the places that really need this investment, and much of my career has been working in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, in many of these places, the national governments or the city governments, they don't actually know where their assets are. So the ability to actually get that data to build the digital twin isn't there yet. And one of my concerns is that we end up in a situation where we're making the developed world that has got all this sophisticated information, the data, more and more resilient, using more and more sophisticated tools, and actually we're not focusing our efforts on thinking about how do we direct flows of finance to where it's needed most, and that's where it's needed most geographically, and then within those geographies, how to direct it to the communities that are the most vulnerable, where we can really drive positive systemic change.
Thank you very much, Joe. And a final question to everyone. What can we do to accelerate resilient infrastructure systems? Investing in resilient infrastructure systems. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think that it is important for the climate finance to be able to adapt to, and sometimes talking about finance, you need the money not just to implement policies, but also to know exactly where to implement this kind of policies and for who. And I think that sometimes you can face some technical problems. For instance, maybe the governments that were before you, or when it was not a priority for the government to put money into this kind of analysis. And I think that in Catalonia, for example, we are like 15 to 20 people, something like this, in the climate change office, which is a large number of people for a region. But it is impossible for us to go to the streets and take the data, right? So we need to adapt our way of working, and we align ourselves and we rely to the statistics department, for example. No, it's okay. Who have been doing like the mathematics for years. And sometimes they are not studying exactly what you need to know or what you want to know, but I think that it is important for the climate change teams to adapt what they know and what they have to your narrative to try to make possible this kind of policies. And I would like to add that the inclusion for us of the climate justice in the indicators is not only for having a better analytical tool, it is also a statement of values, because it reminds us that adaptation is not a luxury for the most privileged people. It's not a luxury for the people who can pay for private health systems, for example. It is a right for all, right? So, I think that it urges us to make this a priority.
Thank you very much. Excellent point to make sure that we bring that forward. And Joe, what would be what you say we should do from now, let's say, immediately to COP30? How can we accelerate investments, decision-making, alignment, so that Global South can actually benefit from resilient infrastructure, but that we have a common global opportunity to drive this process in the system way?
So I think there's two things. I mean, in order to build resilience and adaptive capacity to climate change in the countries that need it most, we need to listen to those countries in terms of what they need in order to cope with the situation they're in. The first day of COP here, I listened to country after country coming up in the plenary, talking about the challenges they face. They know those challenges better than anyone, and we need to listen to what help that they need, and then think from that end about what interventions might actually enable those communities and countries and cities to be able to cope over the next decades, and then to say what type of finance can best help it. Whereas where we are at the moment is the conversation is going the other way around, because we're at COP and it's the parallel conversation. Both bits have to happen, but the other conversation is about the quantum of money that is needed to actually tackle the issue. And so if we come out of this COP, which I very much hope we do, with a commitment to flows of finance, then between now and the next COP, we've got to work really hard to think about how are we going to make sure those flows of finance are directed to where they're needed most?
Thank you very much. And two final thoughts from Rodrigo.
Yeah, so basically on what was, I think there are three components that are really key for us to drive change. It's awareness, trust, and the third one is also, I forgot capacity building that I have here. Capacity, indeed. But awareness, when I'm saying awareness, people don't know exactly what kind of what the risks and how can you be resilient exactly, and the tools that exist today to quantify. In many cases, if you go to the finance sector, they need quantification. They work with numbers. We know that, right? So we need to be able to help them and to increase trust. That this exists. So we need to be able to do storytelling, to communicate this way, and we should leverage the tools that exist today to provide better visualization and better quantification. There are tools to quantify, measure, and act on climate change, and we need to tell, to showcase, and to storytell. This is one important aspect. Then in terms of trust, there are indicators, there are common approaches. I'm seeing efforts from the MDBs trying to build indicators. They released a study 3 days ago about a joint effort from MDBs to create indicators for resilience, including resilience and adaptation there. But there are other standards, like Envision rating system for sustainable and resilient infrastructure. Well, several engineering firms are adopting there more and more. There's Blue Dot Network, which is also adopted for many organizations. And capacity building for sure. We cannot go to all these countries that Global South and talk about these technologies, talk about these resilience indicators and all that, and not creating this capacity for them to use the tools to increase their resilience here. I think that's really important.
Very good point on capacities and also on the many different frameworks and myriad of indicators that are out there. We have to also make more simplified approaches for improving decision making and action and finance flows. And one final line from you so we can close this very rich discussion, Natalie.
Sure. I think one thing is that adaptation needs to become investable, and it needs to provide a return on investment, because we don't really see it as an investable area at the minute for infrastructure, in the same way that mitigation is. But we also need whole economy adaptation, because at the portfolio level, it's very hard to do it if the systems around you don't work under pressure. I also think we do need more data and transparency on adaptation, because there is a bit of a gap compared to, for example, carbon footprints. You can get the carbon footprint of pretty much everything, but can you really get the data on what the adaptation requirements or the risks are there? And I think that policies could definitely focus more on physical climate risk disclosures. So the key risks, the losses, the valuation impact and resilience plans. The TCFD is becoming mandatory in a lot of places, so that is starting to happen. But I think that there could be more done there. Also, loss and damage isn't really that cool, right? Like, people don't like talking about these things. And it's also a highly political subject too. But I do think that resilience is super important, and it will only become more important as we see more and more extreme events and more frequent.
So in that sense, I'm very happy to close this panel. We are definitely out of time. I did not do a very good job by keeping this panel short, but I want to say the conversation has been very rich, and I would like to frame a challenge that maybe for next year we can have much more clear opportunities for investing in adaptations. There are already several solutions and options, but it's not mainstreamed. And at the point where it's not coming from the many different actors that play a very important role in there, then we still have a lot of work to do. Improving the capacities, bringing that global perspective, and of course working with all non-state actors and governments across the world. Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Will before he kills me.
Thank you to all our panelists. I mean, please take a seat or stay seated as you're most comfortable. I mean, today's panel was incredibly rich, and thank you for being so candid as well in sharing where the action is for you today. It really stood out to me as this is the value of COP, being able to bring these stakeholders together and put yourselves alongside each other to really have these conversations and get a single source of the truth on where we stand today. And it really stood out to me that there is this, we can really see the action is there already, particularly around the question, what risk is my asset exposed to? But we can also see how the question is changing, and we can see how cities and others are starting to think about, well, what value does my asset contribute to the broader resilience of a city or a community? And it's how do we help move this question from beyond simply risk assessments to understanding the contribution and the economic, social value that assets offer to the resilience of a society as a whole. And we've heard how getting the language right is going to be a key part of this, but also making it actionable, giving something we can measure to be able to put money behind. So please join me again in thanking all of our speakers who joined us in the panel today. Let me remind you, please don't go too far. In 25 minutes, we've got a session right here in the Resilience Hub, exploring integrating Indigenous knowledge into adaptation. And then again, towards at 4:30 today, we're going to explore the finance gap and how do we get funding into the right place. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day at COP.